The courthouse steps were slick with morning rain as 12-year-old Maya clutched her worn backpack, her bare feet splashing through puddles that reflected the gray October sky. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her thin face, and her clothes, hand-me-downs from the church charity box, were too large for her slight frame. But her eyes burned with a determination that seemed far too mature for her age. Today was the day her father would face Judge Harrison Blackwood, the most feared magistrate in the county, known for his harsh sentences and unwavering adherence to the letter of the law. Maya had spent the last 3 months living with her elderly grandmother after her father's arrest. The small apartment above the corner grocery store barely had enough space for 2 people, but Grandmother Rosa had welcomed Maya with open arms and endless bowls of rice and beans. Every night, Maya would kneel beside her narrow cot and pray for her father's freedom, whispering the same words her mother had taught her before the cancer took her away 2 years ago. God works in mysterious ways, Mija. Sometimes the impossible becomes possible when we have faith. The courthouse loomed before her like a fortress of granite and marble, its towering columns casting long shadows across the plaza. Maya had never been inside such an imposing building before. The security guards at the entrance looked down at her with suspicion as she passed through the metal detectors, her grandmother's rosary beads clicking softly in her pocket. She had hidden them there for courage, along with a crumpled photograph of her family taken during happier times, her father's strong arms wrapped around her and her mother, all of them smiling at some long-forgotten joke. As Maya made her way through the maze of corridors, following signs that pointed toward courtroom 12, she overheard snippets of conversation from lawyers in expensive suits and court clerks shuffling important-looking documents. The words armed robbery, 3 strikes law, and life sentence floated through the air like daggers aimed at her heart. She knew her father wasn't guilty. He had been working double shifts at the construction site to pay for her mother's medical bills, coming home exhausted and covered in dust every night. But the evidence seemed stacked against him, and their court-appointed lawyer had already prepared Maya for the worst possible outcome. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 12 creaked open, revealing a chamber that felt more like a cathedral than a place of justice. The vaulted ceilings stretched high above polished wooden pews, and at the far end, an imposing bench sat empty, waiting for Judge Blackwood's arrival. Maya slipped into the back row, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. Soon, this room would determine whether she would ever see her father as a free man again, or if she would become another orphan lost in the system's machinery. Judge Harrison Blackwood had not always been confined to a wheelchair. 23 years earlier, he had been an ambitious prosecutor who jogged 5 miles every morning before dawn, played tennis on weekends, and climbed mountains during his vacations. But a drunk driver had changed everything on a rainy Thursday evening in March, crushing his spine and stealing the use of his legs forever. The accident had hardened something inside him, transforming what had once been a compassionate heart into something cold and methodical. He dispensed justice now like a machine, calculating sentences with mathematical precision and showing no mercy for those who broke society's rules. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Blackwood's motorized wheelchair hummed through the side entrance, his black robes flowing behind him like the wings of some dark bird of judgment. His steel-gray hair was perfectly groomed, his jaw set in a permanent line of stern disapproval, and his pale blue eyes seemed to look right through people rather than at them. He had earned his reputation through decades of harsh sentencing, believing that the law was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. Mercy, he often said, was a luxury society could not afford. As he positioned himself behind the elevated bench, his wheelchair hidden from view by the wooden barrier, Judge Blackwood surveyed the courtroom with practiced efficiency. He noted the prosecutor's confident posture, the defense attorney's nervous shuffling of papers, and the defendant, Miguel Santos, who sat with his shoulders squared despite the orange jumpsuit and shackled hands. But it was the small figure in the back row that caught his attention for just a moment. A young girl with enormous dark eyes who seemed to be staring directly at him with an intensity that was both unsettling and oddly familiar. The judge's daily routine had become as rigid as the metal braces that had once supported his legs during years of futile physical therapy. Every morning at exactly 5:30 a.m., he would transfer himself from his hospital bed to his wheelchair, complete an hour of upper body exercises that left his shoulders burning, shower using the specialized equipment that had turned his bathroom into something resembling a medical facility, and dress himself in the same black suit he had worn for the past decade. His breakfast was always the same: black coffee, dry toast, and a handful of prescription medications that did nothing to ease the constant ache in his lower back. The irony was not lost on Judge Blackwood that he, a man who had lost the ability to walk, now held the power to take away other people's freedom. Some nights, when the pain kept him awake and the silence of his empty house pressed down on him like a weight, he wondered if his harsh sentences were justice or revenge, punishment for a world that had stolen his mobility and left him feeling like half a man. But morning always came, bringing with it another day of cases, another opportunity to impose order on chaos, another chance to prove that the law was stronger than any personal tragedy or hardship. Miguel Santos had calloused hands that told the story of 20 years spent mixing concrete, laying foundations, and building the homes where other people's families would create memories. He had emigrated from El Salvador when Maya was just a baby, carrying nothing but hope and a fierce determination to give his daughter opportunities he had never had. His English was imperfect, peppered with the accent of his homeland, but his love for Maya transcended any language barrier. She was his entire world, the reason he worked 18-hour days and saved every penny he could spare. The night of his arrest played over and over in Miguel's mind like a nightmare he couldn't escape. He had been walking home from the construction site after another double shift, his body aching and his mind focused on the stack of medical bills waiting on his kitchen table. The convenience store robbery had happened just minutes before he passed by, and the description the witness gave to police, a Latino man in work clothes, had sealed his fate. His alibi was his supervisor, but the man had already gone home to Mexico to visit his sick mother and wouldn't return for months. Sitting in the defendant's chair, Miguel's eyes searched the courtroom until they found Maya in the back row. She looked so small and fragile, wearing a dress that had probably belonged to some other child before finding its way to her grandmother's closet. But her chin was lifted with the same stubborn pride he had seen in her mother, and her dark eyes burned with a fierce loyalty that made his heart ache. He wanted to tell her to go home, to spare herself the pain of watching him receive what everyone expected would be a life sentence, but he also knew that nothing could keep her away. The court-appointed lawyer, a tired-looking man named Peterson who was juggling 30 other cases, had already explained the harsh reality of their situation. The state's three-strikes law meant that Miguel's two previous minor offenses, a bar fight from his youth and a driving without a license charge, would count against him. If convicted of armed robbery, he would face life in prison without the possibility of parole. Peterson had tried to negotiate a plea bargain, but the prosecutor was seeking maximum penalties across the board, driven by political pressure in an election year. Maya had visited him just once in jail, her small hand pressed against the thick glass that separated them, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered into the phone that everything would be okay. Miguel had wanted to be strong for her, to tell her not to worry, but the words had stuck in his throat like broken glass. How could he promise his daughter that everything would be okay when he knew he might never hold her again, never see her graduate from high school, never walk her down the aisle or meet his grandchildren? The weight of those stolen futures pressed down on him heavier than any load he had ever carried on a construction site. Rosa Martinez had lived through 8 decades of joy and sorrow, watching the world change in ways both wonderful and heartbreaking. Her small apartment above the grocery store was filled with the remnants of a lifetime: faded photographs of family members long gone, religious medals from pilgrimages to sacred sites, and the lingering scent of candles burned in countless prayers. She had raised 7 children of her own, buried a husband and 2 sons, and now found herself caring for Maya with the same fierce devotion she had shown all those years ago. Every morning before dawn, Rosa would kneel before her altar, a small table covered with white lace and adorned with statues of various saints, and pray for Miguel's freedom. She had taught Maya the old prayers in Spanish, the words her own grandmother had whispered during the Revolution, when hope was the only currency that mattered. Dios aprieta pero no ahorca, she would tell Maya. God squeezes, but does not strangle. It was a lesson learned through decades of hardship, a belief that even in the darkest moments, divine mercy could break through like sunlight through storm clouds. Rosa had always possessed what her neighbors called the gift, an ability to see beyond the surface of things, to sense the spiritual currents that flowed beneath everyday life. As a young woman in her village, people had come to her for guidance, seeking her dreams and visions to help them navigate life's challenges. She had foreseen her husband's accident 3 days before it happened, had dreamed of her daughter's pregnancy before even her daughter knew, and had known with absolute certainty that Miguel was innocent from the moment she heard about his arrest. But it was Maya who truly amazed her grandmother. The child possessed something Rosa had rarely seen in her long life, a faith so pure and powerful it seemed to radiate from her like heat from a flame. Maya prayed not with the desperate pleading of someone asking for favors, but with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew the outcome. She spoke to God as if he were sitting right there in the room, sharing her hopes and fears with the easy intimacy of a child talking to a beloved grandfather. The night before Miguel's sentencing, Rosa had dreamed of her late husband, Carlos, standing in a field of white flowers that stretched to the horizon. He had looked exactly as he had in life, his weathered face creased with smile lines, his eyes twinkling with a mischief that had first attracted her to him 60 years ago. "Tell the girl," he had said, his voice carrying on a wind that smelled of jasmine and rain, "that tomorrow she will plant a seed of faith, and from it will grow a miracle that will change many lives." Rosa had awakened with tears on her cheeks and the absolute certainty that something extraordinary was about to unfold in that sterile courthouse. The prosecution's case unfolded with methodical precision, each piece of evidence laid out like stones in a wall designed to imprison Miguel Santos for life. District Attorney Patricia Williams, a sharp-featured woman with ambitions for higher office, presented security footage that showed a figure of Miguel's approximate height and build fleeing the scene. The convenience store owner, his voice shaking with remembered terror, testified about the hooded man who had demanded money while brandishing what appeared to be a weapon. The witness who had identified Miguel in a lineup spoke with conviction, pointing directly at the defendant with unwavering certainty. Defense attorney Peterson struggled against the tide of evidence, his voice growing more strained with each witness. He presented Miguel's work schedule, showing that his client had been at the construction site until just 20 minutes before the robbery, barely enough time to reach the crime scene. He called character witnesses, fellow construction workers who spoke of Miguel's honesty and dedication, neighbors who testified about his devotion to Maya, and the parish priest who described Miguel's quiet faith and generous spirit despite his own struggles. Judge Blackwood listened with his usual impassive expression, his fingers steepled as he absorbed testimony from both sides. His reputation for harsh sentencing preceded him into every courtroom, and the attorneys knew that mercy would be in short supply. He had heard similar cases hundreds of times before, desperate men making desperate choices, families torn apart by crime and poverty, defense attorneys grasping for reasonable doubt where little existed. The law was clear, and his duty was to enforce it without sentiment or sympathy. As the hours passed, Maya remained perfectly still in her seat, her dark eyes never leaving the proceedings. Other spectators shifted restlessly, whispered among themselves, or checked their phones, but the young girl sat like a statue carved from stone, her lips moving occasionally in what appeared to be silent prayer. Several times, Judge Blackwood found his gaze drawn to her, puzzled by the calm intensity that seemed to surround her like an invisible force field. When the prosecution rested their case, the weight of inevitability settled over the courtroom like a shroud. Even Peterson's closing argument, passionate though it was, felt like a voice crying out in the wilderness. He spoke of reasonable doubt, of circumstantial evidence, of a hardworking father who would never risk losing his daughter by committing such a crime. But everyone present could feel the momentum of the case, the inexorable march toward a guilty verdict that would separate Miguel from Maya forever. The only question that remained was whether Judge Blackwood would show any mercy during sentencing, and his track record suggested that hope was futile. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, a short time that spoke to the strength of the prosecution's case and the weakness of the defense's arguments. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were grim, and none of them looked toward the defendant's table, where Miguel sat with his head bowed in prayer. The foreman, a middle-aged accountant whose voice barely rose above a whisper, delivered the verdict that everyone expected: guilty on all charges, including armed robbery and assault with a deadly weapon. Maya felt the world tilt beneath her as the words echoed through the courtroom. Around her, she could hear Miguel's sharp intake of breath, the prosecutor's satisfied murmur, and the scratch of reporters' pens capturing the moment for tomorrow's headlines. But through it all, she heard something else, a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her heart, calm and clear as mountain water. "Do not be afraid," it whispered. "This is when faith becomes real." Judge Blackwood cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the courtroom's tension like a blade. "Mr. Santos," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 23 years on the bench, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of armed robbery in the first degree and assault with a deadly weapon. Given your prior convictions and the state's three-strikes law, I am required to sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. However, before I formally impose this sentence, the court will hear any final statements." Peterson rose on unsteady legs, knowing that his words were merely formalities in a process that had already reached its conclusion. He spoke of Miguel's character, his love for his daughter, the injustice of a system that would forever separate a father from his child based on circumstantial evidence. His voice cracked as he painted a picture of Maya growing up without her father, becoming another casualty of a justice system that had forgotten mercy in its pursuit of order. It was then that Maya stood up. The movement was so sudden and unexpected that it drew every eye in the courtroom. Judge Blackwood paused mid-sentence, his gavel frozen in his hand as he stared at the young girl who had risen from her seat in the back row. She was small, almost lost in the oversized dress that hung from her thin shoulders, but something about her presence filled the room with an electric tension that made everyone hold their breath. "Your Honor," she said, her young voice carrying clearly through the silence, "may I speak?" The courtroom erupted in whispers and shuffling as Maya walked down the center aisle, her bare feet silent on the polished marble floor. Judge Blackwood's face showed the first crack in his professional composure, surprise, perhaps even confusion, as this child approached his bench with the steady determination of someone twice her age. Court bailiffs moved instinctively toward her, unsure whether to intervene, but something in her bearing made them pause mid-step. "Your Honor," Maya said again, her voice growing stronger as she drew closer to the imposing judicial bench. "My name is Maya Santos. Miguel Santos is my father, and I know he didn't do what they say he did." Her words carried a conviction that seemed to resonate through the vaulted chamber, and Judge Blackwood found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by something he couldn't quite identify in her tone. "Young lady," Judge Blackwood began, his voice stern but not unkind, "this is highly irregular. The court appreciates your love for your father, but—" "Please," Maya interrupted, a breach of protocol that would have resulted in immediate removal from any other judge's courtroom. "I have something to offer you." She reached into her worn backpack and pulled out a small, leather-bound book that had belonged to her mother, a collection of prayers and meditations that had provided comfort during the darkest days of illness. "My grandmother told me that you've been in that wheelchair for a long time, that you lost the ability to walk in an accident." The silence in the courtroom became absolute. Even the court reporter's fingers paused above her keys as every person present strained to hear what would come next. Judge Blackwood's face had gone pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his wheelchair. No one spoke about his disability in his courtroom. It was an unwritten rule, a boundary that had never been crossed in all his years on the bench. "I can heal you," Maya said simply, her dark eyes meeting his with unwavering certainty. "I can make you walk again. All I'm asking in return is that you free my father." The words hung in the air like smoke from a candle that had been suddenly extinguished, impossible to ignore, yet equally impossible to believe. Nervous laughter began to ripple through the spectator section, starting as scattered chuckles, but building towards something that bordered on hysteria. Judge Blackwood felt heat rising in his cheeks, a mixture of embarrassment and anger that this child would dare to make such a mockery of his courtroom and his condition. "Miss Santos," he said, his voice carrying the edge of authority that had silenced countless defendants and attorneys, "you will return to your seat immediately. This court does not traffic in fairy tales or false hope. Your father has been found guilty by a jury, and the law requires—" "The law," Maya said quietly, "but not justice." The laughter that had begun as nervous energy transformed into something uglier as Maya's words settled over the courtroom like a challenge thrown down before kings. Attorneys shook their heads in disbelief. Court clerks exchanged glances that spoke of pity for a delusional child, and spectators whispered among themselves about the sad spectacle of grief driving a young girl to desperate fantasies. Even Miguel, watching from the defendant's table with tears streaming down his face, wanted to call out to his daughter to stop, to spare herself this public humiliation. But Judge Blackwood found himself studying Maya's face with an intensity that surprised him. There was no madness in her eyes, no desperate pleading or wild fanaticism. Instead, he saw something that reminded him of his own childhood, a time when he had knelt beside his bed every night and prayed with absolute certainty that God was listening, that miracles were not just stories from ancient books but real possibilities in the modern world. That faith had died the night a drunk driver had stolen his legs and left him trapped in a prison of paralyzed flesh. "You think you can heal me?" Judge Blackwood asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "You think you can undo 23 years of paralysis, reverse the damage to nerves that were severed in a car accident, make whole what medical science has declared permanently broken?" Each word carried the weight of decades of disappointment, of treatments that had failed, of hopes that had been crushed under the relentless reality of his condition. Maya nodded solemnly. "My mother used to say that God doesn't make mistakes, only mysteries. She said that sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a beginning that we can't see yet." She opened the small prayer book, its pages yellowed with age and soft from countless readings. "Before she died, she told me that I had been given a special gift. Not just for seeing what's hurt in people's bodies, but for helping to fix it." The prosecutor, District Attorney Williams, rose from her seat with an expression of outrage. "Your Honor, this is a clear attempt to manipulate the court through emotional appeals and fraudulent claims. I move that the child be removed from the courtroom and that you proceed with the sentencing, as required by law." Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who saw Maya's offer as nothing more than a calculated distraction designed to prevent justice from taking its proper course. Judge Blackwood raised his hand for silence, his mind racing through decades of legal precedent and courtroom experience. Everything about this situation violated protocol, challenged the boundaries of rational discourse, and threatened to turn his courtroom into a circus. Yet something in Maya's unwavering certainty gave him pause. "And if you fail?" he asked quietly. "If you touch my legs and nothing happens? Will you accept that your father must face the consequences of his conviction?" Maya's answer came without hesitation. "And if I succeed? If God works through me to give you back what you lost? Will you accept that maybe my father is innocent, that maybe justice means more than just following rules?" The courtroom held its collective breath as Judge Blackwood considered Maya's proposition. 23 years of medical consultations, experimental treatments, and false hopes had taught him to approach any promise of healing with deep skepticism. Yet something about this moment felt different, charged with a possibility he had long since abandoned. Perhaps it was the way Maya stood before him with no trace of doubt or fear, or perhaps it was the growing realization that his harsh interpretation of justice had become a cage as confining as his paralyzed legs. "Very well," he said finally, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. "But we will do this properly." He gestured to the bailiffs. "Clear the spectator section. What happens next is not a matter of public entertainment." As the courtroom slowly emptied of reporters, curious onlookers, and court personnel, Judge Blackwood felt his heart rate accelerating for the first time in years. The only people who remained were the essential court staff, the attorneys Miguel and Maya, witnesses to what would either be a miracle or a profound disappointment. Maya approached the judicial bench with the same steady composure she had shown throughout the day. Judge Blackwood used the controls on his wheelchair to lower himself to her level, bringing his face closer to hers. Up close, he could see the deep intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet strength that seemed far too mature for someone so young. "What exactly do you plan to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I'm going to pray," Maya said simply. "And I'm going to put my hands on your legs. My grandmother says that healing happens when we become empty enough for God to fill us up." She looked directly into his eyes, her gaze unflinching and serene. It might hurt at first. Sometimes broken things have to be taken apart before they can be put back together the right way. Judge Blackwood nodded slowly, then used his arms to transfer himself from his wheelchair to the floor, a movement he had perfected over decades of adaptation. The marble was cold against his legs that had lost all sensation below his damaged spine, legs that had become nothing more than dead weight he carried through each day. Maya knelt beside him, her small hands hovering just above his motionless limbs. "Close your eyes," she whispered, and something in her tone compelled him to obey. In the darkness behind his closed eyelids, Judge Blackwood became aware of Maya's hands settling gently on his legs, warm and light as butterfly wings. At first, there was nothing, the same absence of sensation he had lived with for more than 2 decades. But then, gradually, he began to feel something that started as a tingling warmth and grew into something that could only be described as electricity flowing through nerve pathways that medical science had declared permanently severed. The sensation began as a whisper of warmth, so faint that Judge Blackwood initially dismissed it as wishful thinking or the phantom sensations that had tormented him in the early years after his accident. But the warmth grew stronger, spreading through his legs like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For the first time in 23 years, he could feel Maya's small hands resting on his knees, could sense the texture of his trousers and the coolness of the marble floor beneath his body. "Oh my God," he whispered, his voice breaking as tears began to stream down his face. The tingling sensation was growing stronger, accompanied by something that felt like lightning dancing along his spine. Every person remaining in the courtroom watched in stunned silence as Judge Blackwood's legs, which had lain motionless for more than 2 decades, began to tremble slightly. The movement was barely perceptible at first, just the faintest flutter of muscles that had been dormant for so long they had nearly forgotten their purpose. Maya's face was serene, her eyes closed in deep concentration as she continued to pray in a mixture of English and Spanish, words that seemed to flow from someplace deeper than conscious thought. Her grandmother's rosary beads had somehow found their way into her hands, and they clicked softly as her fingers moved through familiar prayers. The courtroom, usually filled with the harsh fluorescent buzz of modern lighting, seemed suffused with a golden warmth that had no visible source. The first intentional movement came as a shock that reverberated through Judge Blackwood's entire body. His right foot flexed upward, a simple motion that would have been unremarkable in anyone else, but was nothing short of miraculous for a man who had not moved his legs through in over 2 decades. The movement was followed by another, then another, as nerve pathways that had been severed in twisted metal began to reconnect through some process that transcended medical understanding. "I can feel them," Judge Blackwood gasped, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "I can actually feel my legs." He attempted to bend his knee, and though the movement was weak and shaky, it was unmistakably real. Around the courtroom, hardened attorneys and court officials wept openly as they witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the boundaries of possibility. Maya opened her eyes and smiled, not with triumph or pride, but with the quiet joy of someone who had simply been a vessel for something far greater than herself. Slowly, carefully, Judge Blackwood began the process of standing up. His legs shook with the effort of supporting weight they had not carried in decades, and he had to grip the edge of his bench for support, but he rose to his full height for the first time since that terrible night when a drunk driver had changed the course of his life. The man who had dispensed justice from behind the barrier of his wheelchair now stood tall and whole, his face transformed by an expression of gratitude and wonder that made him look 20 years younger. "The charges against Miguel Santos are hereby dismissed," he said, his voice ringing with authority and something new: compassion. "This court finds that justice is not merely the application of law, but the recognition of truth, mercy, and the possibility of redemption." He looked directly at Maya, who had quietly moved to embrace her father as Miguel wept with relief and joy. "Sometimes," Judge Blackwood continued, "the wisdom of a child can illuminate truths that escape the understanding of adults. Today, this court has learned that there are forces in this world more powerful than any law written by human hands." As father and daughter embraced in the center of the courtroom, surrounded by witnesses to a miracle that would be retold for generations, Judge Blackwood took his first steps in 23 years, not just toward the door of his courtroom, but toward a new understanding of justice that balanced law with mercy, judgment with compassion, and the letter of legal code with the spirit of divine love that makes all healing possible.